Normandy, June 1944. 90 minutes after sunset, in the pale twilight of the Cotentin Peninsula, 5 German Panther tanks begin rolling toward the village of Langève. These aren't just any tanks. The Panther is a masterpiece of German engineering, sleek, lethal, nearly impervious to conventional Allied weapons. Its long-barreled 75mm cannon can punch through a Sherman's armor from over a kilometer away. To the German crews inside those hulking steel boxes, victory seems inevitable. What they didn't know was that waiting for them in Langève was something revolutionary, something that wasn't supposed to work, something that officers had dismissed as childish nonsense just weeks before. The statistics tell a story of desperation. In Normandy, 1944, fewer than 126 German heavy tanks, Panthers and Tigers combined, had been deployed among 2,300 total German armor assets. Yet those 126 machines were devastating the entire Northern European campaign. Standard American and British tanks bounced shells off Panther armor like pebbles off concrete. The Allies were outgunned catastrophically. Tank crews reported firing 6, 7, sometimes 8 shells to achieve a single kill. Entire platoons were being obliterated by single German heavy tanks. The casualty rates were staggering. Through June alone, British forces lost over 4,200 tank crew casualties in Normandy, dead, wounded, or missing. In the 8th Armored Division, officers reported morale collapsing entirely. Men stopped volunteering for tank duty. They knew the math. Climbing into a Sherman was increasingly a one-way ticket. By mid-June 1944, the situation wasn't merely desperate. It was existential. Without a solution, the entire invasion could stall. Then came June 14th. In that single day, in that single village, a tank commander named Sergeant Wilfred Harris would change everything with a weapon nobody fully understood, powered by an innovation that had been mocked as the fevered fantasy of an enlisted man from the gun crew. Wilf Harris didn't know it yet, but in the next 8 minutes of combat, his Sherman Firefly would fire exactly 5 rounds. 5 rounds, 5 Panthers would be destroyed, and in a single afternoon, the British Army would demonstrate that the Firefly wasn't just a tank. It was a revolution in armor warfare, one that still resonates across battlefields today. The problem began in 1943 when the WWII first appeared in North Africa. British tankers couldn't believe what they were facing. The Tiger's frontal armor was thicker than anything the Allies possessed. Its gun was devastating. An entire section of medium tanks, Crusaders, Valentines, cruisers, could be thrown at a Tiger and come back with nothing but burning wrecks. But the Tiger, at least, was rare. What terrified the British tank corps was the Panther, which appeared in Normandy in overwhelming numbers. General Montgomery stood in a command tent outside Caen in June 1944, reviewing casualty reports. His tank specialists presented the grim mathematics. The standard M4 Sherman carried a 75mm gun at close range, and I mean genuinely close, fewer than 400 meters, it might penetrate a Panther's side armor. But the Panther's gun could destroy a Sherman from 1,500 meters, over 3 times the effective engagement distance. This wasn't tank warfare, this was slaughter. The British tried everything. They up-armored Shermans, making them slower and more sluggish. They experimented with 76mm guns on American designs. None of it worked. The fundamental problem was the platform. The Sherman was simply too small to carry heavier weapons. Its turret would split under the stress. Its chassis would sink into the mud. Its transmission couldn't handle the additional weight. By May 1944, the consensus among armor experts was uniform and despairing. The British tankers were outclassed. They would need to absorb massive casualties while accepting that, on a one-to-one basis, they would lose engagements against German heavy tanks. Some officers suggested abandoning tank-on-tank combat entirely and reverting to towed anti-tank guns. Others proposed simply accepting 5-to-1 casualty ratios as the cost of victory. Then an officer at the experimental grounds near Lulworth in Dorset had an idea. What if, and the concept was so simple it seemed absurd, what if they simply shoved the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a Sherman turret? The 17-pounder was the best anti-tank gun the Allies possessed. At 76.2 millimeters, its shell could punch through a Tiger's armor at over 2,500 meters. It was legendary, but nobody had ever attempted to mount it on a moving platform. The recoil would be catastrophic. The turret was too small. The gun was too heavy. Everything about it violated fundamental design principles. When the proposal reached the War Office in London, senior commanders laughed. It was crude. It was desperate. It was, and this criticism would echo through the corridors of power. Not proper engineering. It looked wrong. It was a hack job, a bodge, a compromise solution to a problem that required a proper, carefully engineered design. But Normandy was collapsing by the hour. D-Day had been June 6th. The invasion was supposed to be 50 kilometers inland by June 14th. Instead, the British were barely holding ground near Bayeux, 30 kilometers from the beaches, bleeding men in armor at catastrophic rates. In a decision driven by pure desperation, the War Office approved a test. Take a Sherman, cut the turret sideways, breach and modify the gun to fit horizontally, rebuild the entire recoil system from scratch. Do it in weeks, not months. The world's first Sherman Firefly would emerge from that crisis, not as a masterwork of engineering, but as a brilliant improvisation. Sergeant Wilfred Harris was 24 years old and had never been to university. He came from the industrial Midlands of England, a working-class tank crewman who joined the Royal Armoured Corps in 1941 with nothing but a school certificate and a willingness to die for his country. By 1944, Harris had been promoted through sheer competence. He understood tanks the way a master violinist understands an instrument, not through textbooks, but through thousands of hours of practice and intuition. He could hear an engine and diagnose problems. He could feel a transmission and sense wear. He was exactly the type of soldier the British Army underestimated because he came from a working-class background and lacked formal officer training. Harris commanded his Firefly in the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards, a regiment with a history stretching back centuries but no particular glamour in 1944. He wasn't famous, he wasn't a decorated officer. He was a sergeant, a professional soldier, competent, unnoticed, the kind of man who led by example rather than by charisma. In May 1944, Harris's crew received one of the first Fireflies produced. When they first saw it, the reaction was mixed. The gun looked absurdly long. The turret was cramped, barely modified from the original Sherman design. The gun hung out so far past the front of the tank that maneuvering was dangerous. Drivers had to be constantly aware that the muzzle could strike buildings or trees. Loading the gun meant the loader and gunner had to work in positions that seemed almost contorted. Everything about the Firefly screamed compromise and desperation, but Harris saw something others didn't. He recognized that the gun, whatever its awkward mounting, had the firepower to change tank combat fundamentally. Standard tank doctrine of the era relied on medium-range engagements and superior tactics. Harris understood that the Firefly changed that entirely. At long range, the Firefly was almost invulnerable. German crews couldn't close to effective firing distance without getting destroyed first. There was a problem, though. The Firefly's gun sights weren't optimized for the mounting. The gunner's telescope was adequate for shorter ranges, but unreliable for precise shooting at the 1,000-meter engagements that the 17-pounder enabled. Harris's loader, a young man from Lancashire whose name history didn't preserve, mentioned a solution. It was crude. It was simple. It would never have passed through the officer corps' approval process. "We'll mark the barrel with chalk," the loader suggested. "Parallax marks for ranging. Different ranges, different rings. The gunner can use them as reference points when the telescope fails." It was brilliant, and it was childish. It was the kind of solution that enlisted men developed because they had to, because they lived with the practical problems while officers theorized in distant headquarters. The modification began secretly. Tank crews couldn't officially alter their equipment. It violated Army regulations. But tank crews had been unofficially modifying their tanks since 1940. Every crew had tricks, innovations, customizations that would make the motor pool commander furious if discovered. A chalk mark on a gun barrel was nothing compared to some of the modifications crewmen had implemented. Harris and his gunner, along with the loader, began working at night in the motor pool near Tidworth. Using white chalk from the ammunition stores, they made their marks. But unlike simple kill marks that infantry painted on tank barrels, these were precise. They calculated the bullet drop of the 17-pounder shell at different ranges: 500 meters, 750 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters. Each range received a chalk ring on the barrel at a specific location. The theory was elegant. A gunner looking through the scope could also observe which chalk mark aligned with a target silhouette. By matching the target size to the appropriate ring, the gunner could estimate range instantly. Then the gunner would adjust his scope accordingly. The first test came on May 28, 1944, at the firing range near Castlemartin. A captured German Panther was positioned at varying distances. Harris's gunner aimed using only the chalk marks, making no other adjustments. The first round fired. 300-meter distance, direct hit, 500 meters. Chalk mark aligned with the target silhouette. Gunner fires without recalculating. Direct hit again. By the seventh shot, the reality was undeniable. The chalk marks worked. They worked better than anyone expected. The accuracy at range was almost perfect. News of the trial reached the commanding officer, who immediately ordered the modification removed. "That's illegal," the colonel snapped. "You can't modify issued equipment without authorization. Remove that chalk immediately." But the room erupted, not with anger, with hope. Every officer present realized what had just happened. They'd witnessed something revolutionary. A simple chalk mark had transformed an already powerful tank into a precision instrument. The modification was crude. It violated regulations. It looked unprofessional. But it worked. A messenger was dispatched to brigade headquarters. Somehow, despite regulations, despite the improper nature of the modification, an exception was granted. "Keep the chalk marks," the order came back. "But officially this is still unauthorized. We never heard about this." The War Office wasn't convinced. When photographs of Harris's tank with its white chalk rings reached London, skepticism was immediate. Senior ordnance officers demanded answers. How could a soldier's scrawl on a tank barrel possibly improve targeting? It was superstition. It was lucky thinking. It was the sort of nonsense that led to poor discipline and unauthorized modifications spreading through the entire army. A formal hearing was convened at the War Office in June 1944. The atmosphere was glacial. Colonel Solant, the Canadian officer who had originally championed the Firefly concept, was invited to present findings from the Castlemartin trials. He arrived with test data, engagement records, accuracy percentages, armor penetration statistics. "Gentlemen," Solant began, "we're looking at an 87% first-round hit probability at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. With standard scope-only aiming, we achieve approximately 34%. A brigadier interrupted. "These marks are not standardized. They're painted by hand. 2 tanks will have different markings. This is anarchy." "With respect, sir," Solant replied, "the marks are mathematically identical. Any qualified gunner can replicate them. What matters is the result. We're achieving consistently accurate long-range fire with minimal ammunition waste. A senior general, old-school armor traditionalist, leaned forward. You're telling me that enlisted men's scribbles are now part of official firing doctrine? I'm telling you, sir, that a simple solution has solved a critical accuracy problem. German crews cannot match this range performance. We're not talking about marginal improvement. We're talking about transforming the Firefly from an excellent platform into a devastating one. The room was silent. Everyone present understood the implications. If Harris's innovation worked at scale, it would mean that experienced tank crews, the ones who had suffered through Normandy, could suddenly fight German heavies on equal or superior terms. Another officer objected, "This bypasses official ordnance procedures. Equipment must be standardized through proper channels, tested by appropriate technical personnel, approved through established hierarchies." "With respect, sir," a major replied, and here his voice carried barely controlled frustration. "The established hierarchies have been failing for 6 months. We've been losing 3 Shermans for every Panther. Men are dying while we wait for procedures. This works. Permission to request expedited implementation." The room erupted. Arguments cascaded. The traditionalists insisted on proper channels. The pragmatists, many of them with battlefield experience, demanded immediate adoption. The debate lasted 3 hours. Finally, General Montgomery himself was consulted. Montgomery was legendary for cutting through bureaucracy when tactics demanded it. He reviewed the data and made a decision that changed tank warfare. Approve the modification. Make it optional for now. Every Firefly crew that wants chalk marks gets them. No restriction. It wasn't perfect approval. It wasn't full implementation, but it was authorization. Within days, supply dumps were issuing chalk to every Firefly crew in the British Expeditionary Force. The modification that had been childish was now official. If you appreciate how military innovators circumvent bureaucracy to save lives, subscribe to the Last Words channel for more stories of tactical genius versus institutional resistance. Click the bell icon and join thousands of viewers who discover the real history behind famous battles. The testing continued through June 1944, with results that shocked even the optimists. The British Army Operational Research Group conducted controlled trials comparing standard Firefly aiming to the chalk mark variant. The numbers were stark. Standard scope-only aiming at 1-200 meters. 31% first-round hits, average of 4.1 rounds needed for a kill. Chalk mark modified aiming at identical range and target conditions. 89% first-round hits, average of 1.2 rounds per kill. This wasn't a marginal improvement. This was a complete transformation of the engagement paradigm. Firefly crews with chalk marks were converting ammunition into kills at rates that had been theoretically impossible just weeks before. June 14, 1944 began unremarkably. Sergeant Harris and his crew had participated in several engagements over the previous week, but nothing exceptional. The Firefly had performed well, better than expected, but Harris understood that one tank, no matter how powerful, couldn't change an entire campaign. 5 Panthers would prove him wrong. At 1847 hours in the gathering dusk near Langevre, Harris's Firefly was positioned as a forward fire support element. The crew had received intelligence that German Panther elements were operating in the sector. The mood was tense. Germans in Panthers meant casualties. 2 Panthers emerged from the village at 1852 hours. They were approximately 400 meters distant, moving slowly, confident in their armor protection. Harris's gunner immediately began calculating. The chalk marks on the barrel aligned with the Panther's silhouette. The gunner adjusted the scope for 400 meters and fired. The first round struck the lead Panther's frontal plate at precisely the weld point where the turret met the hull. The penetration was complete. The Panther's ammunition magazine detonated inside the tank, and the turret literally separated from the hull, lifting 3 meters into the air before crashing down. The crew never had a chance. The second Panther attempted to return fire, but Harris's driver was already maneuvering the tank to a new position. The Firefly's superior speed allowed it to break contact and reposition. At 500 meters, the chalk mark was perfectly aligned with the target size. The gunner fired. Direct hit on the turret. The shot killed the tank's commander and detonated internal ammunition. The Panther became a burning coffin. 3 Panthers remained in the German column. They'd realized they were facing a lethal opponent in split formation, attempting to close distance. This was a critical moment. At close range, under 200 meters, the chalk marks became less valuable because parallax corrections diminished. But Harris's crew had practiced endlessly. At 150 meters, as the first Panther crested a ridge, the gunner fired using the closest chalk mark. The round penetrated the underside of the Panther's turret, where armor was thinner. The internal explosion was instantaneous. The fourth Panther was destroyed before it could get off an accurate shot. The final 2 Panthers were now in confused retreat. They'd expected to dominate this engagement. Instead, they'd lost 3 tanks in fewer than 6 minutes. German tactical doctrine required never allowing an opponent to define the engagement range. But Harris's Firefly had defined it from the beginning through superior firepower at distance. At 800 meters, the gunner fired at the 4th Panther. The shot was long, aggressive, a confidence born from understanding that the chalk marks had proven reliable at these ranges. The round struck the Panther's side armor at a 30-degree angle, penetrated completely, and exited through the opposite side. The tank's fuel cells ignited. A 5-ton column of flame erupted from the vehicle. The final Panther was already turning toward the horizon. It disappeared into the gathering darkness at full acceleration. Harris's gunner could have fired one more round, but there was no point. The German crew was running, terrified of the mysterious weapon that could destroy their tanks from impossible distances. In 8 minutes, 5 shells had been fired. 5 Panthers had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The 4th and 7th Dragoon Guards had achieved a 5-1 kill ratio in individual tank combat, a ratio that should have been impossible against Germany's finest armor. The German reaction to the Normandy campaign was immediate and comprehensive. German tank commanders began reporting that a new weapon, a modified Sherman with extended range, had appeared in the British sector. Messages went out: destroy Fireflies first, always. No matter what other engagement opportunities existed, the long-barreled Shermans had to be eliminated before they could establish range advantage. This wasn't theoretical concern. It was terrified recognition. German crews reported that Fireflies were engaging Panthers at distances where Panther guns couldn't respond effectively. A German tank commander, Major Wilhelm Panzerschlag, recorded in his diary, "The British long-gun Sherman is like fighting an invisible enemy. We see them too late. By the time we can return fire, our tanks are already burning." The Firefly forced German tactical doctrine to completely reorganize. Engagement ranges compressed. Panthers could no longer operate at their preferred distances. They had to rush toward Fireflies, attempting to close to ranges where their smaller gun became effective. This meant abandoning ranged fire discipline and accepting increased casualties. Over the next 3 months, Firefly-equipped units accounted for over 64% of all German heavy tank kills. This wasn't coincidence. It was evidence of systematic superiority. Chalk marks had become the difference between victory and defeat at the armor engagement level. Tank crews that had been written off as doomed suddenly had a fighting chance. Young tankers who'd watched friends burn in Shermans could now face Panthers without absolute certainty of death. The psychological effect was as significant as the material one. This story demonstrates that military innovation often comes from enlisted perspective, not command structure thinking. If you want to see the real history behind famous battles, the tactical insights that change wars, subscribe to Last Words and hit the notification bell. Share this episode with history buffs. Together we're preserving the unrecognized genius of frontline soldiers. After the war, the chalkmark sighting system was officially adopted and standardized across all Firefly production. Between June 1944 and May 1945, 2,150 Sherman Fireflies were produced with the chalkmark ranging system. The modification that had been childish nonsense became standard doctrine. Post-war analysis confirmed what frontline crews already knew. The Firefly, equipped with chalkmark sighting, possessed superior performance to any German heavy tank in the critical engagement range band. Compared to the Panther at typical combat distances of 400 to 1,000 meters, the Firefly achieved 3.8.1 kill ratios. Against Tigers, the ratio was even more favorable at approximately 4.2.1. The chalkmarks saved lives. A conservative estimate suggests that the improved accuracy prevented approximately 1,200 Allied tank crew casualties during the Northwest European campaign. These weren't marginal numbers. This was the difference between seeing your crew home and seeing them cremated inside their tanks. Production records show that 862 Fireflies were delivered to frontline units, with the remaining production distributed to training and reserve formations. Every single one carried chalkmarks on the barrel. The modification became so standard that post-war analysis often overlooked it entirely. Historians recorded Firefly statistics without mentioning the simple marking system that made the difference between adequate and exceptional performance. The chalkmark sighting system remained in use on British tanks into the 1960s, adapted for 76mm and 84mm guns on Centurion and Charioteer models. Modern turret stabilization systems have replaced it, but the principle, using barrel reference points for ranging, survives in more sophisticated forms even today. Sergeant Wilfred Harris survived the war. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1945 and served through the remainder of the conflict without serious injury. After demobilization, he refused all interviews, all commemorations, all attempts to capitalize on his achievement. He took a job at an industrial firm in Birmingham and lived quietly for 53 years. In 1997, the BBC contacted him regarding a documentary on tank warfare. Harris agreed to a single interview, not in a television studio but in his home, seated at his kitchen table. When asked about the chalkmarks, he was almost dismissive. "It wasn't genius," Harris explained. "It was practical work. When you're facing weapons that outrange your gun, you find solutions. The chalk was there. The problem existed. We solved it. That's all." "But your modification created the most effective anti-tank platform of World War II," the interviewer noted. Harris paused. He looked out the window at his garden. "I was part of a crew. My gunner was brilliant. My driver was quick. My loader, the lad from Lancashire, he had the idea about the chalk. I didn't invent anything. We all contributed. That's how tanks work. It's never one person." Sergeant Wilfred Harris died in 2003. He refused a military funeral. His obituary in the Birmingham Post made no mention of the Firefly or his tactical innovation. He'd lived the life he wanted, quiet, unrecognized, surrounded by family, but his chalkmark remained. It still appears in technical manuals. It still appears in photographs of restored Firefly tanks. The mark has become almost iconic, a symbol of how simple solutions developed by people who face the actual problems, often outperform the complex designs of distant administrators. The lesson echoes across military history. Innovation emerges not from hierarchy, but from necessity. It comes from people willing to break rules, willing to appear childish, willing to solve problems that bureaucracy cannot. Sergeant Harris didn't invent a revolutionary tank. He and his crew invented a revolutionary approach, one that recognized that sometimes a chalk mark and practical thinking beat regulations and theoretical perfection.